Hello, YouTube channel. Welcome to Read with Maxine in 2025. I dropped off the radar for the past couple months of the year, but I am alive and doing well, and I hope all of you are also. Join me on my journey through the Rory Gilmore reading list, where I tackle the over 400 books mentioned in the original 7 seasons of the Gilmore Girls series. From Shakespeare and Jane Austen to Dr. Seuss and Nora Ephron, the list includes a little bit of everything. Let's get reading. I am launching into 2025 with a continued goal of filming one video a month with a camera that is focused. Here we go. One video a month to record my progress on the Rory Gilmore reading challenge. So I'm back in action. One of the reasons that I didn't film a lot toward the end of the year was actually that I was not making a ton of progress on the list. There are a couple reasons for that. One that I've already alluded to was I was busy. I went to Europe with my husband in November, had family here for Thanksgiving, and then, the holiday season kind of kicked into gear. So part of it was just that I was spending a little bit less time reading. The other part of it was I was chewing my way through The Count of Monte Cristo, which I will discuss in detail more in a moment here, but I really enjoyed that book, but it took me forever. So another reason was I didn't feel like I had that much to share. So this video, I will have fewer books than I usually do, especially because I'm covering 3 months of reading. I feel like that's all right, just to kick off the new year with a shorter video. So just in terms of a summary account where we are in the Reading Like Rory journey, I am up to 30 books on the list. So since my last video, I read 4 books on the list, Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Bell Jar, and Beowulf. I also read a couple of bonus books, which I will discuss at the end of the, I wanted to show you, she wasn't a short one either, which I'll discuss more at the end of the video. All right, the first book that I will be covering, which I read in November, is Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress, which is a novel I discovered after I read it, a semi-autobiographical novel actually, by the Chinese-French author Sijie. My sincere apologies. I am probably massacring his last name. I listened to a couple of pronunciation guides and I can never get the Mandarin intonation right for Mandarin words or names, so my apologies. I'm doing my best. So the novel has 2 protagonists, 2 young men, and it is set in China during the Cultural Revolution, and both of these young men have been relocated from the city where they grew up and lived with their families into the country to be re-educated. So people who were relocated to be re-educated, usually it was from urban areas into more rural areas where people were less exposed to international, especially Western ideas, writing, music, art, and where lifestyles were more traditional, and where the party members in the rural communities could exert a lot of influence over what people were talking about, seeing, doing, and also kind of monitor these young people very closely. The main action of the novel centers around these 2 protagonists. They're kind of 2 best friends finding their way in this new community where they've been reassigned, and they make another friend who has also been relocated for re-education in a neighboring town. And this kid has a suitcase full of books that his parents gave him so that he could smuggle out, and they include a lot of Western classics. So one of the kind of major subplots and major thematic explorations in the book is reading, and especially reading classics. And it's always, I love a book about books, love a book about reading. I'm sure all of you do as well. So I really enjoyed it for that reason. And that's actually what inspired me to read The Count of Monte Cristo, because that is one of the books that they read and love in the novel. And they're young men kind of coming of age. So they're really inspired by kind of heroic romantic tales that they encounter in these Western classics like The Count of Monte Cristo, which was the second book that I read in November and into December. I actually mostly listened to the audiobook for that because I was reading it while I was traveling to Europe and decided after I got the book from the library and kind of started reading the hard book and then decided not to carry it with me to Europe, and also decided to take advantage of like the plane flights and wandering around the cities that I was visiting to listen to the audiobook. It was also fun to be listening to The Count of Monte Cristo because I was in France for part of my trip, and although I was not in Paris or the south of France where most of Count of Monte Cristo is set, it was still fun to be speaking French and hearing French around me, and then be listening to a novel that is set mostly in France as well. So that was kind of a fun little connection to my personal life. So I mostly listened to the audiobook for The Count of Monte Cristo, and she was so long. I wrote down in my notes, how many hours was it? That audiobook was 44 hours long. So there's a lot of content. That is a big book. And I was surprised that, it feels long in the sense that it feels like an epic. It covers a lot of ground. But I was surprised that I was kind of expecting to be like, all right, let's keep it moving. Some of the other classics that I have discussed so far on this list that are that length or close, although I don't think Crime and Punishment or Anna Karenina was that long. Some of those had some moments where I was feeling the length more so than I was with Count of Monte Cristo, and I think the major difference is the Count of Monte Cristo is much more of an adventure action story. It's much less internal than some of those other novels that I alluded to. So I guess the lesson for writers there is you can write as long as you want if you keep it action-packed. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. Maybe my real lesson for writers is I think Dumas, and especially The Count of Monte Cristo, is a great author to study if you want to practice really building momentum for your story, building that sense of adventure and excitement and action that really keeps the plot going. Reading that book was kind of like going to an action movie where, going into it, you're like, oh my God, this movie is 2.5 hours long. How I'm going to be so bored. And then you come out of it and you're like, wow, I didn't even really notice the time going by. I didn't have to get up and pee, whatever the case may be. And it's because there's so much momentum and so much ground covered and a lot of excitement. The Count of Monte Cristo is about revenge, and revenge is truly a long game in that book. And I think that's part of the fun too, is it's, in some ways, it's almost like an elaborate riddle, watching the very intricate long-term revenge plots kind of play out. So yes, definitely a lesson in pacing, but still very long. So also a warning for readers, if you're looking into reading The Count of Monte Cristo, expect it to take a while, or hopefully you're someone who just wants to really sink into a story like that long term. So after I read The Count of Monte Cristo, I was looking for something very different. The next book that I picked up in December was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And I actually had not read this before. I was really excited to, and it is another semi-autobiographical novel. So both Balzac and The Little Chinese Seamstress and The Bell Jar are both semi-autobiographical novels, both very different in style and subject matter, etc., etc. But I think that they're both really wonderful examples for writers if you are interested in mining details of your own life to include in your writing. And I think they're both fascinating examples of how, where you can kind of play with the bounds of reality and what kinds of things you might want to fictionalize. For both of those authors, I was able to find pretty detailed accounts online articles, interviews, etc., of the true autobiographical details of their lives, so that I had some kind of frame of reference as I was thinking about what they had fictionalized and how they had used details from their own lives to tell their stories and build realistic, compelling characters, and, you know, kind of use their writing to explore important aspects of their own life without writing a straight memoir, and the ways that they were able to use fiction to explore corners of their life that truth wouldn't necessarily allow them to do. So I think if that is a kind of writing that's very interesting to you, then I would say both of these would be wonderful candidates for examples. A little break from the reading list and toward the end of the year, and read my 2 bonus books. So the first one that I read was one that I had a study guide writing assignment for. So I wrote the study guide for this book. It's got my half price book sticker on it. So this is, I'm wondering how many of you are familiar with this series. I actually wasn't, and then as I did research into it, I realized how popular it was. In fact, this even has the medallion on the cover, over 10 million copies sold. So this is a very popular series I had not heard of, by Lucinda Riley. So this is the first book in an 8-book series, and the series is titled The Seven Sisters, as is this first novel. I've already recommended this to one of my friends for her book club, and I think for those of you who do book club type discussions, this would be a really fun one, especially if your book club is interested in reading a series. I say that and then also say that it wasn't my favorite book that I've ever read. I'm not giving this one 5 stars, but it was very fun to read, and I think it would be really fun to discuss with a book group, and especially if you wanted to continue with this series. So, as the name implies, the series is about a group of sisters. It's a very odd, kind of fantastical premise at the outset, which is maybe part of what I got hung up on, because otherwise these are very realistic historical fiction novels with dual timelines, a modern character who is one of the 7 sisters, and then a character in the past who is one of her ancestors. So the kind of premise for the series is these 7 sisters were all adopted from all corners of the globe by their adopted father, who was a very wealthy, very quirky, very mysterious single man who has this like super mansion on the shores of Lake Geneva. It's like this crazy, beautiful, huge house that's only accessible by boat, and none of his daughters, even into adulthood, really know what he does for a living, like how he got all this money. And they don't call him by his name or call him dad. They call him by a nickname that the eldest daughter made up when she was a kid, Pa Salt. And they call their home Atlantis. And I think that's actually a really good representation of like how fantastical this house feels. You know, it's like definitely one of those kind of the start. It almost feels like the start of sort of a cheesy romance novel where everything is intentionally fantasy and, you know, kind of dream world ideal, like this just super privileged family, this beautiful home. All of the sisters are gorgeous. Like the main character of this first novel is the eldest sister, and she's supposedly like the family beauty. But when she describes all her other sisters, they're all like, you know, equally gorgeous. I feel like, and they are romance as well. But they don't read like those kind of beach read fantasy romance, fantastical, not fantasy genre, but you know, fantastical dream world type romances, except for they kind of have that set up. So I feel like that's maybe part of what I struggled with, is there's a little bit of mismatch there. But so I don't think this is a spoiler because this is the premise for the whole series. In fact, I even say, yeah, it says it on the back. Pa Salt dies. That's kind of the inciting incident for the novel. And all the sisters kind of return home to Atlantis to mourn him, and he's like left them weird, mysterious clues about their origins because none of them know where they were adopted from, or who their birth family was. Well, there's a clue, there's an illusion that maybe one of the sisters does, but anyway, not this sister, not Maya, who's the protagonist of this novel. So that's kind of quick, happens at the beginning, and then Maya kind of sets off on a journey of self-discovery and follows Pa Salt's clues, which lead her to Brazil. It turns out she was born in Rio de Janeiro, and then it introduces the dual timeline, which is her great-great-grandmother, she comes to discover, who lived in Rio in the 1920s, and her story is wrapped up in the story of the building of the Christ the Redeemer statue. So one of the very strong selling points for this novel, and one of the reasons I really enjoyed it, is the historical context, exploring the process of building that incredible statue. It's a really interesting time in history for me, the 1920s and into the 30s, and really interesting location, Brazil. I have not had the opportunity to read that many stories set in Brazil, and especially not set in the past. Rio seems like a really fascinating city of great contrasts and a lot of like cultural complexity. And then also the process of building the Christ the Redeemer statue, just like a fascinating feat of engineering and art. So that's a really cool context for the book, and one of the main reasons that I would recommend it. And then there's a romance story for both, in both timelines, which is fun for book club reading, all of that. So yeah, I would recommend. Again, it's not a perfect book, but those are hard to find, or perhaps don't exist, depending on who you ask. Oh, sorry, my camera. There we go. We're back. We're not too blurry. So in terms of lessons for writers, I think I would point to some of that mismatch and frustration that I had with the book, in terms of making sure that all elements of your work, especially if you're doing something this complex, like writing a dual timeline, setting up a series, this is a complicated task that the author set for herself, and I feel like she fumbled some elements of it, because it almost felt like the protagonist's kind of weird fantasy upbringing, and again, I don't mean fantasy in the sense that there's like fairies and magic and things like that, but just like weirdly ideal upbringing and past feels like, and there were problems in her past, it's not that, but it just feels super unrealistic. Like it feels like something you would imagine for a book. And you don't want your readers to be kind of thinking that, when it's otherwise a very realistic book that's obviously quite well researched. The historical facts are accurate. There are true historical figures who appear in the book. So, you just want to make sure that the tone and the content and the depth of the different elements of your book match up. And again, I think that gets more challenging the more complex you make your novel. So bite off what you can chew, and then carefully review. My second bonus book that I read for this chunk of months is The Shadow of What Was Lost, which is the first book in a 3-part series, the Lycanius trilogy. Book 1. And I have book 2 on my shelf over there. I've actually had these on my shelf for a long time. I think I only have book 1 and 2. I don't have 3 yet. I think they're beautiful covers, and I think I actually got them in a little free library when I was like out on a run in Berkeley, and kind of ran past and then like doubled back and thought, that looks like a book I would read. And so I picked them both up, and I've been wanting to get to them. And I think after Monte Cristo and the Bell Jar, I was just ready. And after, writing a study guide for this, which is a lot of work writing those study guides, I was just kind of ready to just enjoy a little bit. Not that I'm not enjoying all the other books, but, I was ready for a shakeup. So I decided to dive into this one. And the quote on the cover makes a reference to the Wheel of Time series. Love the Wheel of Time. This is about to become your new favorite series, from the Barnes & Noble sci-fi blog. And I completely agree. There are lots of Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan vibes going on in here. The narrative voice, the fictional setting, the characters have a lot of vibes. They give me a lot of Wheel of Time vibes. So if you like Wheel of Time, you'll like this, I think. And in fact, maybe some of the frustrations that I had with Wheel of Time, I did not have with this one. He treats women with more respect than Robert Jordan does. Female characters in Wheel of Time are annoying, and all of internet has expressed their opinions on Wheel of Time, the way women are written in the Wheel of Time, and I agree. So I don't need to repeat that here, but this book doesn't make that same mistake, and it is very kind of dense, high fantasy in the same way that Wheel of Time is. So that was fun. I'm not going to dive right into the sequel yet. I'm going to give it a little bit of time and keep working on my Rory Gilmore books, but I'll probably read the sequel sometime in the next couple of months. My advice for writers wanting to write in that genre is just like read, because all of these books do have kind of a similar tone. A lot of the books in the genre have this very similar tone and narrative voice and perspective, and I think being a writer who's trying to enter that space, it's really important to know what space you're entering and hopefully introduce something new and not be derivative, but also you need to kind of understand what voices you're in conversation with. So I think, you know, for example, if you love Wheel of Time and you're trying to write a Wheel of Time type book, you should read this. If you love Tolkien and you're interested in writing a Tolkien-esque book, you should read Wheel of Time and this. You know, it's just important to have that context. So recommended, definitely for hardcore fantasy fans, mostly. All right, and then the final book that I'm going to be covering for this film is Beowulf. And I just finished Beowulf this past weekend. I had a lot of fun with this because I was looking for the audiobook. I did a long run over the weekend, and I was going to be out running for like 3 hours. And I was like, I bet I could crush Beowulf just in the process of like warming up, doing my run. And I did. So I was looking for the audiobook, and I discovered that the Audible original series, Audible Originals, you know, the free books that Audible has, they had Beowulf read in the original Old English. So I downloaded that and listened to about 30 or 40 minutes of the narration in Old English. And I got a total kick out of that. It was fascinating to try to kind of pick out meaning, which was virtually impossible, but there were words here and there. But more, I was just kind of enjoying listening to the cadence and kind of thinking about the origins of English and the evolution of English, and kind of hearing the poem in the form in which it was originally written. So that was really fun. If you are planning to read or reread Beowulf and are interested in, the idea of the evolution of language and English language in particular, and also if you are interested in poetry and cadence and rhythm and rhyme, it was really cool to listen to it because it's, you know, you're listening to a foreign language, so you can just kind of hear the sounds. So I highly recommend, and it was a fun context for the translation that I ended up selecting, which again would very highly recommend. In fact, I think I'm giving her 5 stars. So not just Beowulf, but this particular Beowulf translation. So it's titled, they titled it A New Translation, but the translator is Maria Dahvana Headley, and I will make sure that her name is in the notes for this video. She took a really, I was going to say modern perspective, but I think I'm actually going to say postmodern perspective in translating Beowulf, and uses a lot of current terms, and you know, she uses like bro and hashtag blessed and stuff like that in her translation of the poem, And she also uses a lot of traditional language. So it's not just like a straight, like, oh, I'm going to write this in like 2024 talk, and try to like be cool with the kids. It's that she used all of English that she had at her disposal to make a translation that she felt was most authentic to the meaning of the poem. And there's a lengthy note, translator's note at the beginning, and I would highly recommend listening to it. Do not skip it, because her her thoughts on the history of translating Beowulf, its cultural significance, what she was thinking about as she was translating it, it's fascinating. So I had a blast with that. And it was a fun connection because I'm reading another bonus book right now, which let me go grab so I can show you. I'm reading this other book right now, which is not on the Rory Gilmore list, The Stories of English by David Cristo. And this is a nonfiction book about the history of the English language. The first sentence on the back says, "The English language is now accepted as the lingua franca of the modern age, but how did it evolve? How did a language spoken originally by a few thousand Anglo-Saxons become one used by over a quarter of the human race? A groundbreaking and entertaining history of the language." So I just had happened to buy this from the bookstore where I volunteer in December or November, and was so excited to listen to Beowulf a little bit in the Old English and then this new translation, and listen to the translator's note and have my curiosity about the evolution of English kind of sparked again, and was a great segue into this book. So that's what I'm thinking about now. And I really, honestly, I encourage anyone who loves reading and thinking about words, which I think is probably everyone listening to this channel, to listen to that new translation of Beowulf. It's under 4 hours long. And honestly, even if you just listen to the translator's note and then, the first hour or something of the poem, if you already know the story, just to kind of get a feel for the language and the beautiful cadence and rhythm and playful rhymes that the translator has managed to achieve. It is a fascinating testament to the brilliance of some writers. This translation of Beowulf is really an incredible feat, and also I think a fascinating testament to the longevity and staying power of some stories, and kind of thinking about storytellers and language users throughout throughout time is a important and fun context to have for your own writing. And I think listening to something like this translation of Beowulf will really make you think about words as words. And that's something that can be easy to forget when we're writing, and isn't possible to do always when we're writing, or we'd never manage more than a couple words at a time. But I think it's a really cool reminder to kind of think about everything that's packaged up into each word that we use, and all of the rings of time and people and culture and space, that are reflected in each word that we use, and how we stack words together to make meaning. And I look forward to sharing more about my reading journey with you in the continuing months. I am officially through all of the A's on the Rory Gilmore reading list, except for The Archidamian War by Donald Kagan, which I am having a very hard time locating. So I'm going to continue hunting for that and continue working my way through my B's, while also jumping around a bit, as you've seen, kind of dipping into the C's to do Count of Monte Cristo, or Carrie, or some of the others that I've grabbed from further down the list. But plugging my way along and excited to share with you. So I will be back on in February, and until then, happy reading.